Story 1. I'll never forget my first year working in the ICU. I had signed up for the night shift because, well, the stories were true. That's where you'd see things that stayed with you, things that never made it to the morning briefing. It was a small hospital in a big city, and we had our fair share of rough cases. It was an old building too, creaky floors and narrow hallways with bad lighting, especially at night. Half of the ICU was undergoing renovations, so the patients we did take in were kept in close quarters. That place always had a heaviness to it, especially in the night shift. But there was one night, one case that settled that unease into something colder. I remember it was around Halloween. The place was at capacity, like always, but this time we had two patients who were an absolute nightmare, figuratively and literally. They were at opposite ends of the ward, but you could still feel the tension radiating between them. One was a man in his late 40s, big guy, loud, with this scar that ran from his eyebrow to his jaw. His name was Mike, but to us he was just the pimp. His injuries were extensive, mostly burns that had him wrapped up in bandages from the waist up. Down the other end of the hall, they kept his ex-girl, as the other nurses called her. She was younger, early 20s maybe, name was Lisa. She'd come in with burns that nearly covered her face and neck, but the worst was the damage from smoke inhalation. We could never get a clear story from her before she'd been put on a ventilator. But from what we knew, he'd lit her on fire, and in some kind of desperate act of survival or vengeance, she'd latched onto him as they both burned. If you asked me, it was like she wanted to drag him down with her. She was barely hanging on, and we all knew it was only a matter of time. The thing was, neither of them knew the other was in the same ICU. There was an unspoken rule that if you were assigned to him, you didn't talk about her, and if you were with her, you didn't talk about him. Some kind of silent agreement to keep whatever hatred or horror they shared from spilling over into our hallways. That night I was assigned to Lisa. I remember checking her vitals, looking over her chart, noting how her lungs were still barely functioning. She'd had a bad night, worse than usual. She was slipping fast, and part of me felt like maybe she'd just given up the fight. The monitor beside her beeped steadily, but her chest barely rose. I tried to talk to her sometimes, hoping maybe she could hear me. Maybe it'd help her hang on. But she never reacted, just lay there, face obscured by gauze and tubes, her breath so faint I'd have to lean in just to hear the raspy rhythm. About an hour later, her monitor started screaming. I looked up, and there it was. Flatline. We called the code and I jumped in, doing compressions while my partner handled the meds. We worked on her for almost 20 minutes, and it was as if the whole place was holding its breath. When we finally stopped, I looked around the room, half expecting her to just open her eyes to jolt back to life. But Lisa was gone. We packed up, turned off the machines, and covered her with a sheet. I walked out of her room, and the hall felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down. Most of us were on edge, and some of the nurses went for a coffee break just to get out of that section for a while. There was this silence, an oppressive sort of quiet that settled after a death. I remember thinking, thank God she was finally free of him. And then I heard it. Down the hallway, the pimp started screaming. I'd heard him before. He had a mouth on him for sure, and the man hated nurses, hated doctors, hated anybody in a uniform. But this was different. The hairs on my arms shot up as his voice cut through the quiet, echoing down the hall. Get her out, he screamed, a hoarse, desperate roar that seemed to tear through him. Get the goddamn bitch out of my room, now! Every single one of us froze. His voice was raw, jagged, like he was being tortured. Another nurse, Maria, shot me a look, her eyes wide, and we both hurried down the hallway toward his room. His bed was surrounded by machines, and he was hooked up to a dozen monitors, unable to move more than an inch without setting off an alarm. He couldn't have gotten up if he tried. We pushed the door open, and there he was, thrashing as much as his injuries would allow, eyes wild and unfocused, fixed on something in the corner of the room. His face was twisted in terror, his bandaged hands reaching out as if to ward off something only he could see. Sweat poured down his face, matting his greasy hair against his forehead, and his mouth moved in a near hysterical chant. "She's here," he gasped, voice cracking. "She's right there. I can see her." He looked at me, desperation and something else, something primal burning in his eyes. "Get her out," he whispered. "She's waiting for me. I can feel it." I took a step back, unsure if I was even breathing at this point. Maria tried to talk him down, saying, "There's no one here, Mike. You're alone. It's just us." But he wouldn't hear it. He started sobbing, shaking, eyes darting around the room as if he was trapped. The alarm started going off as his heart rate spiked. He flinched, gasping, and pointed at the corner again, where the shadows seemed just a shade darker, heavier. "She's waiting," he choked out, each word trembling. "I can smell the smoke. She's burning. She's still burning." It hit me then, the smell, a faint, acrid scent that lingered in the air, like burned hair and scorched fabric. The smell was faint but unmistakable, and it chilled me to the bone. Maria's face went pale, and we both exchanged a look that said everything. We couldn't see her, but he did, and by the look in his eyes, she was closer than we'd ever know. Story 2. I'd been a nurse for years, and I thought I'd seen it all, or at least enough to stop believing that anything could surprise me. People don't like to talk about what happens in hospitals after dark, what we see, what we don't understand but pretend to. We're supposed to be the professionals, right? So when things go wrong, when something falls outside the usual explanations, well, we tend to brush it off, laugh it off. But I still remember that night, the way the hallway felt different, colder. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed just a little louder than usual. Or maybe I only remember it that way now because of what happened. It was the graveyard shift, the one that always put me on edge. There's a different kind of quiet that settles over a hospital at night, as if even the building knows it's time to let go, to let the night in. My shift that night was pretty routine at first, no emergencies, just the usual rounds. My station was across from room 209, where Mrs. Lacey had been placed. Mrs. Lacey was difficult. She was old in her 90s and her health had taken a sharp decline in recent days. She was confused, combative, frail but stronger than she looked. Always struggling against something, trying to get out of bed, yelling out words that didn't make sense. I'd seen patients like her before. People who, in their last days, seemed to fight the hardest, thrashing and yelling as if something we couldn't see was holding them down. She had a sitter in there with her, a younger nurse's aide named Abby, just to keep an eye on her so she didn't hurt herself or someone else. I'd pop my head in occasionally to see Abby looking exhausted, trying to keep Mrs. Lacey calm, her eyes wide and alert, as if she knew something was going to happen. Then it started. The monitors in her room began beeping. First a slow warning sound, and then faster, insistent. My heart dropped. I knew the rhythm. I knew what it meant. Mrs. Lacey's heart rate was dropping, fast. I rushed in with 2 other nurses, one of whom was already calling her vitals. 30, 20, and then it was a flat line, just like that. I checked her pulse. Nothing. Cold as marble. Her eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling. We weren't supposed to resuscitate. Her DNR was clear. It wasn't the first time I'd watched someone pass, but I still took a shaky breath as I closed her eyelids and let the monitors go silent. It was over. I stepped outside the room to call her family. Abby stayed behind to do the paperwork, start preparing her body, standard protocol. When I was almost done with the paperwork, Abby appeared in the doorway, white as a sheet. She's moving, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, not quite understanding. Come again? She's moving, Abby repeated, and I could see the terror in her eyes. She wasn't joking. This wasn't some poor taste prank. I'd known her long enough to know the look on her face meant it was something I couldn't ignore. I exchanged a glance with another nurse, who shook her head in disbelief. Together, we walked back into room 209, the 2 of us probably looking more than a little nervous ourselves. And then we saw it. Mrs. Lacey was lying there, still as she had been when we left. Her face was blank, her body still. We took a step closer, and that's when her hand twitched. It wasn't a minor movement, not a muscle spasm, or the result of rigor mortis setting in. No, it was a deliberate movement, a tightening of her fist, as if she were reaching out for something. Her other hand followed, gripping the sheets with surprising strength, almost clawing at them. My breath caught, and then she let out this sound, a horrible, guttural noise halfway between a moan and a scream. I've never heard anything like it before or since. The sound echoed down the hall, chilling the blood of everyone who heard it. It was like she was in agony, like she was fighting against something we couldn't see, something that was dragging her back. And her eyes opened, wide and blank and staring straight at me. "Help! Me!" she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they'd been cemented to the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was gone. I'd checked her pulse myself. Abby let out a small scream, and I snapped out of my trance. I turned to grab her, intending to pull her out of the room. But as I did, Mrs. Lacey's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was impossibly strong, bone-crushing, and ice-cold. Her eyes never left mine as she repeated, "Help! Me!" I tried to wrench my arm free, but she held on with inhuman strength. Her mouth opened wider, and it felt like she was trying to say something more. But the words wouldn't come. The smell in the room shifted then, a staleness I can only describe as old, damp earth. It was suffocating, unnatural, and seemed to press down on all of us. Finally, one of the other nurses pulled me back, and Mrs. Lacey's hand dropped limply to her side. Her eyes fluttered closed, her grip loosened, and that horrible guttural noise stopped. Just like that, she was still again. The monitors around her stayed silent, flatlining, showing no signs of life. We all stood there in stunned silence. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I backed out of the room, the others following close behind me. We shut the door and locked it, then stood there, just listening, barely breathing. But no more sounds came, just the stillness of the room, a silence so absolute it was terrifying. It was only later, long after we'd finished the paperwork, called the family, and completed the night shift, that I found myself alone in the break room, staring at my trembling hands. That night, as I walked through the hallways, every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed darker, and the image of Mrs. Lacey's eyes, open, desperate, filled with an agony I couldn't explain, haunted me. Story 3. I worked in a pediatric hospital, a place where I'd spent more time than I could count. It was a small hospital, but we had a reputation for taking care of some of the most delicate cases. Newborns, kids with cancer, severe trauma. The kind of work that breaks your heart and heals it again, all at once. The oncology unit was on the 4th floor, and I'd heard the rumors from the very first day I started there. The stories about the place being haunted, particularly the hallway just outside the oncology rooms. At first, I thought it was just gossip. Nurses and doctors have their ways of coping with stress, and ghost stories are a common outlet. But there was always something off about the 4th floor. The air was heavier there. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the whole area felt different. Even the lights had a dim, unnatural hue. Some nights I'd walk through it alone, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up, as if I wasn't alone, even though I was. I worked 3 12-hour shifts a week, but on this particular week, I'd picked up some overtime. It was late, past 3 a.m., and I was in the NICU. I was exhausted, long shift, barely any sleep. It felt like everything was muffled, as though the whole world outside the NICU was happening in a distant dream. But a break was long overdue, so I decided to go down to the cafeteria to grab a coffee. The cafeteria was on the 2nd floor, and there was a shortcut, a staircase, right off the oncology unit that led directly down. I'd taken that route plenty of times before, but not at night. Never at night. I don't know why it took me that route this time. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was because the hallway was empty. Maybe it was because I was too tired to even think straight. But as I approached the automatic double doors to the oncology unit, I hesitated. The hallway was dark, quiet, and eerie. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me. I pushed the doors open, and that's when I saw him, a little boy, skipping down the hallway. It wasn't like I'd seen him at first. He was there, and then he wasn't. But that moment, that heartbeat between seeing and not seeing him, froze me in place. The boy was maybe 4 or 5, his thin, hospital-issued gown trailing behind him as he moved. His feet tapped lightly against the polished floor as he skipped toward me, his arms swinging carelessly, his face bright and unbothered. For a moment, I thought maybe a parent was with him, or perhaps he was one of the patients who'd managed to sneak out of his room. "Hey, buddy," I called out, my voice trembling just a little. "Where's your mom or dad?" The boy didn't respond. He just turned to face me, his eyes wide and glassy. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. One moment he was there, just a few feet away, and the next, nothing. No sound, no movement, no trace of him at all. I stepped forward, my heart racing, thinking maybe he ducked into one of the rooms. I checked the hallway, quickly scanning every corner, but it was empty. Not a single sound, not even the hum of the lights above me. I stood there frozen, trying to process what had just happened. My mind told me it was exhaustion. Maybe I'd seen a shadow, a flicker in the dim light. But no, I knew what I'd seen. I turned quickly, my pulse thudding in my ears. I needed that coffee. I needed to get out of there, and I needed to get out now. But as I walked quickly toward the staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence pressed on me like a weight. My skin felt tight, like someone was watching me. I glanced back once more, half expecting to see the little boy standing there again, but the hallway was empty. Still, the feeling lingered. I made it to the stairs and hurried down to the second floor, trying to tell myself it was just a trick of the mind. But even as I grabbed my coffee and sat down in the cafeteria, the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. I couldn't shake the image of that boy, his face, his eyes, the way he disappeared so quickly. The rest of my shift was a blur. I kept expecting to hear a child's voice or to see something moving in the shadows, but nothing happened. The night crept on, and the incident felt like a distant memory, a strange thing that my mind would keep locked away for later reflection. But when I returned to work the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I hadn't said anything to anyone. Who would believe me? But then, I overheard a conversation between 2 nurses in the break room. One of them was recounting a story from her shift last night. "I swear I saw him again," she said. "That little boy, skipping down the hall outside the oncology unit. I thought he was lost, but when I called out, he just disappeared." I froze. My coffee cup shook in my hands. She wasn't talking about the same thing, the same boy. "Who?" I asked too loudly. The nurse looked at me startled. "The little boy, the one who skips in the hallway. You've seen him, right?" I nodded slowly, trying to keep my composure. "Yeah, I've seen him." But now it was real. It wasn't just something I imagined. There were others who had seen it too. And when I asked around later, more and more people came forward with their own stories. Some had seen the boy in the hallway outside oncology, others by the elevators. Some claimed to have heard the sound of tiny feet skipping down the halls, even when the area was empty. I don't know what it was or what it meant, but from that night on, I never took that staircase again. Story 4. I used to work as a med tech at an assisted living facility. It wasn't the easiest job, but it paid the bills, and the residents were mostly sweet, even if some had their moments of confusion or agitation. But there was one night that still haunts me, that I'll never forget. It was the middle of summer, but the air was thick with the oppressive heat. The facility was quieter than usual, the staff a bit more sluggish than normal after a long day. I was on the night shift, a job I'd always hated, but someone had to do it. Most of the residents were asleep in their rooms. The only sounds came from the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of a nurse's shoes against the tile. Margaret was one of the older residents, but she was sharp as a tack. She'd lived in the facility for years, and though she didn't have many visitors, she was well liked by the staff. She had a little pendant, like all the residents did, that they wore around their necks to call for help if they needed it. The pendant had a small button on it that, when pressed, would trigger a light at the nurse's station and alert us to come to the room. It was late when I walked past Margaret's room. Her door was shut, just as it always was at night. The soft glow of the pendant light through the crack in the door told me everything was fine. I didn't think anything of it, but I should have. A couple of hours later, things got strange. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Margaret's neighbor, another resident, Mrs. Lawson, came to the nurse's station. She was in a panic, her frail hands wringing together. "Someone's talking in Margaret's room," she said, voice shaking. "I can hear them clear as day. It's been keeping me awake for hours." We all just looked at her, confused. Margaret hadn't had any visitors in days, not since her daughter had come by a few weeks ago. We all knew the room had been vacant since Margaret's passing the night before. She had passed away unexpectedly, quietly in her sleep, and we hadn't even had time to remove her belongings before her family had come by to collect them. We brushed Mrs. Lawson off, telling her it was probably just the heat playing tricks on her mind. Maybe the vents were making noise. But I remember the look in her eyes as she left, her voice still trembling. I didn't think much of it, but something about the whole situation left me unsettled. Then came the pendant. I was at the nurse's station when I heard the chime. It was faint at first, a little beep that rang out in the stillness of the building. I glanced over at the screen. It was coming from Margaret's room. I froze. There was no way it was her. Margaret had passed away the night before. Her family had cleared out her room hours ago. There shouldn't have been any reason for the pendant to be going off. It hadn't been touched, not once since she died. My heart started to race. I told the other staff, but they just shrugged it off, muttering something about a malfunction. "Go turn it off," one of them said. I was the only one who seemed to care, or maybe I was the only one who wasn't too scared to go check. I grabbed the keys and made my way down the long hallway. As I approached her door, I could feel the air change. The temperature had dropped suddenly, even though it was a blistering summer night. A chill ran through me as I reached for the handle. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, my breath shallow in my chest. The room was eerily quiet except for the soft hum of the pendant light still flashing. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The cold. It was freezing cold, so cold it hurt my skin. I glanced around, confused. The air conditioning had been off all day, and yet it felt like winter in that room. The pendant light above the bed flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. I couldn't explain it, but everything felt wrong. I slowly moved toward the nightstand where the pendant sat. It was still blinking, faint but insistent. I reached out, my hand trembling, and as soon as I touched the light, a sudden bang echoed from the bathroom. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The bathroom door, Margaret's bathroom, slammed shut with a violent force. I stood there frozen. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the closed bathroom door. I could feel the air around me, thick and oppressive. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the door. I slammed it behind me, locking it, and sprinted back to the nurse's station. "Margaret's room. It's wrong," I stammered. "You need to check it." The others stared at me wide-eyed. One of the male staff members, Doug, finally spoke up. He was older, a bit gruff, but he'd been around long enough to know when something was off. "I'll go," he said. He didn't question me, but I could see the tension in his face. "Wait here." I watched him as he walked down the hall toward Margaret's room. The air felt heavier now, thick with something I couldn't explain. I heard the sound of his footsteps fade into the distance. He reached her door and paused. Then I heard him fumble with the lock. The seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, the door opened and Doug walked in. I held my breath as I waited for him to come back. When he finally returned, he didn't say anything. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line. He didn't even look at me. "The door was locked when I got there," he muttered, eyes glazed over, "and there was no one in the room." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The silence that followed was worse than the loudest scream. Something had been in that room, something I couldn't explain, something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that still lingers in the back of my mind every time I close my eyes. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. I will never step foot in that room again, not for anything. Story 5. I worked the night shift at a busy hospital in the maternity ward. a place that's always buzzing with activity, or so it seems. Most nights it's just me, the monitors, the occasional baby crying, and the hum of the call lights that seem to go off at the most inconvenient times, especially when no one's there. But some nights, things happen that don't make any sense. There was this one night. It started out like any other. I had just finished helping with a delivery, and the shift was winding down. The nursery was quiet, the usual lull of machines and distant footsteps echoing down the hallway. I had barely sat down to sip my cold coffee when I heard it, a soft chime, the kind of lullaby you might hear if someone had just delivered a baby. It played through the PA system, clear and sweet, the sound of newborn joy filling the sterile halls. But there was no one in the room where the button was located. I checked. No one. I was alone on the floor, the staff busy with their own tasks elsewhere. At first, I thought it was some sort of glitch. Maybe the button was stuck, or the system was malfunctioning. But then, it played again. The same lullaby, the same eerie chime, like it was celebrating something that wasn't there. I tried to shake it off. I figured it was just a technical issue, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I went over to the soundboard, checked the connections, and everything seemed fine. But the air felt different, thick, like it was holding its breath. I went back to the desk and continued working. I tried to focus, but the lullaby kept ringing in my head. I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. Not long after, the phone rang, and I answered quickly, hoping for a distraction. "Hello, this is Nurse Name. How can I help you?" The voice on the other end was frantic, shaky. "There's been a death in room 23. It's not good, nurse. We need you to come over." I could hear the distress in her voice, the kind of sound you get when something truly terrible has happened. I grabbed my things and rushed to the other unit. When I walked into room 23, I knew what she meant. The heart monitor was flat. There was a stillness in the room that made it feel like time had stopped. The woman on the bed had been with us for a while. She'd been through so much, and now she was gone. I stayed with her for a few minutes, just making sure everything was in order, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something else was happening. The moment I turned to leave, the lights flickered. But it wasn't just the lights. A soft lullaby began playing from the ceiling speakers. I froze. I knew where that sound was coming from. The button, the one you press after a delivery to announce the birth over the PA system. It wasn't supposed to play unless someone activated it. No one had touched it. The lullaby echoed through the empty halls, so soft, so unsettling. It was a beautiful tune, but that night it felt like it was mocking me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence, a glitch in the system. But as I turned to leave, the sound grew louder, like it was following me. I rushed back to the nurse's station, but the lullaby kept playing in my mind. And then, just as I sat down to gather myself, the phone rang again. My hands were shaking when I picked it up. "Hello? This is going to sound crazy, but..." The voice on the other end was a man's, and I could tell he was trying to keep it together. "We're hearing it too, the lullaby. It started playing on its own, and no one's near the button." My heart dropped. He continued, "We're on the other floor, the maternity ward. It's playing from the system, and no one has touched it. It started after the death in room 23. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Was it just some malfunction? Some sort of sick coincidence? But everything felt wrong, like there was something else going on. I hung up and rushed back to the nursery. When I arrived, I expected to find the system unplugged or shut off, but it wasn't. It was still running, and the lullaby was still playing. I reached for the plug and yanked it out. The music stopped abruptly, the silence almost deafening. I stood there, breathless, staring at the system in disbelief. But as I was walking away, it started again. The same song, the same sweet lullaby, as if the system was mocking me, reminding me of the death I'd just witnessed. I ran down the hall to the main switchboard, desperate to get everything disconnected. The lullaby kept playing in the background, echoing in my ears. It wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be. I had unplugged everything. There was no reason for it to keep going. But it did. It stopped only once I completely unplugged the entire system, and I thought it was over. I thought the nightmare was over. That night, after I'd gone home, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that lullaby in my head, and the next day when I came back to work, I heard it again. Just once. A soft chime that seemed to come from nowhere. The entire system had been completely disconnected. There was no way it could have played again. But it did. And I'm telling you, no one could explain it. After that, I didn't go near that system again. I couldn't. They eventually got the wiring checked, but no one ever found a reason. No one ever talked about it again. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Something happened that night. Something I still can't explain. I never stayed late after that. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.